This week on our Boom Picks, we're going to talk about several big name players you might be starting to have doubts about. We're going to tell you should still start them no matter what, and that includes a player who is 0 points all season long.
You're not putting Jerry Jeudy on the booms, are you?
Now, I know it feels like he's gotten 0 points, but trust me, we're going to do better than that. Now, first, we want to keep doing better to help you win, and you can help us by subscribing to this channel if you haven't yet. We're on the way to 100K, but we need your help. If you've watched this channel, if you get any value from the content we put out there every day for you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. So when we talked about start sit for running backs in week 7, it was still kind of hard to wrap my head around the fact that we had to actually discuss Saquon Barkley. And it still feels weird that we're getting questions on the live show from people asking whether they should trade Saquon Barkley. And I know some people are going to just consider that, maybe this isn't it, right? Too much last year. He was due for a down season, right? Too much tread on the tires, all those same arguments. They're crashing after the Super Bowl. Look, you have legit reason to complain. Saquon Barkley, after another down week last week and that loss to the Giants, also hard to believe, he's 27th among running backs in rushing yards per game. 27th, not even an RB2 in that sense, and he's averaging 3.42 yards per carry. Yeah, he is actually behind Cam Scatterboo in terms of rushing output so far. But obviously, I'm going to tell you there's reason to be optimistic here, and not just because of the name, and not just because we assume the Eagles are going to turn around and dominate. It's been bad because it's not his fault specifically. Saquon Barkley has been fine. Maybe he was a little sore last week on a short week on Thursday, but he seems to be fine physically. Get a little bit of an extra rest heading into week 7. But look, it's been the offensive line's fault. It has not been Saquon himself. Right now, he's being contacted behind the line of scrimmage at a rate of 35.8%. Not only is that the highest of his career, even worse than when he was with the Giants behind that offensive line, which is hard to believe, but it's second highest in the entire NFL. Only Ashton Genty behind that Raiders offensive line is having a harder time breaking through, right? And so, is this going to change? Well, you think, how do you fix the offensive line? They are getting some help back with Landon Dickerson practicing. And, this offensive line is still supposed to be really good. I think they'll get it together. And, this week might be the week, not just Dickerson back, but this is a smash spot for him.
It is a smash spot that I don't think a lot of people realize on paper how good of a smash spot it is for Saquon Barkley this week. You look at the Minnesota Vikings defense, they are the second toughest against wide receivers this year, but they're 11th easiest or 11th worst, I guess, against running back. So this is a defense you want to attack by running the football. You don't want to attack this team through the air. What have we seen from the Eagles the last 2 weeks? They've tried to become this pass first type of team, and it has not worked. Look, with the extra rest this week, this is like their mini bye, right? Like the team's mini bye. I feel like they're going to get back to what's working or what worked in the past. They're going to utilize Saquon Barkley this week. And this is a great matchup specifically for Saquon Barkley. You talked about it. Yeah, his yards per carry this year has not been great. But you look at about 70% of his rush attempts this year have been zone rush attempts. Now he's averaging over a yard per carry more on zone rush attempts than man gap rush attempts this year. Granted, it's only 3.6 yards per carry, but it's better. But then you look at the Minnesota defense, they right now are allowing the 4th highest yards per carry on zone rushes and the highest success rate against zone rushes. This is where you attack this defense, on those outside zone runs. You don't try to throw it on this team. You just utilize the speed and the explosiveness of Saquon Barkley. And I think that's what the Eagles are going to do. And we're going to finally see Saquon Barkley have that huge rushing game this week. And look, I'll tell you what else. This to me is absolutely disrespectful. Look, you got your underdog shirt on. You know we love underdog. But they've got his line at 69.5 rushing yards right now. This is Saquon Barkley. Come on. I'm taking the higher on that, no doubt about it. Look, you pair that pick with the Michael Penix Jr. free pick you're going to get this weekend. That's an easy win right there. And just make sure when you join using promo code ENDGAME. Because when you do and you deposit any amount, they're going to match that deposit 50% up to $1,000. Plus, as soon as you play $5, which you can do on these picks right here, they're going to give you another $100 in bonus cash. And of course, Pierre, I know you love this. It's Boostober, which means profit boost every single day in October. Go sign up at Underdog. Use promo code ENDGAME.
Well, not only Chiefs fans, but a lot of fantasy managers are thrilled that it is finally week 7 because that means the return of Rashee Rice. Yeah, he's the guy who hasn't played all season. And let's face it, he barely played last season, 4 games. Then that injury, we knew what was coming. It wasn't the injury that has delayed him, in case anybody's not following along. It was the suspension. But look, this is a good thing. It's done with. You don't have to worry about if it's going to be a late season thing. Is it going to impact the fantasy playoffs? You've been patiently stashing Rashee Rice. You are thrilled right now, absolutely. And there's no question you put him in your starting lineup. Like, I mean, obviously he's playing. We know that. There's no reason he wouldn't, right? He's just been waiting for this suspension to end, right? There's nothing wrong with him physically. He's in shape. He's ready. This is a young guy. This was the number 1 receiver for Pat Mahomes. Now, I cannot break down for you any stats, any separation or target share or anything from this year. And what's the point of looking at last year's stats, right? We hardly had anything to look at. We know what he did in his rookie season. We know what this Chiefs offense looks like. And I'll just point to that. Look, I was a little nervous after the first couple of weeks. This Chiefs team looked like they, kind of like the Eagles, are kind of a little hungover from that long postseason, especially their Super Bowl loss. The Chiefs did not look like themselves. But then again, you didn't have Rashee Rice. You didn't have Xavier Worthy for a couple of weeks, right? Didn't have a whole lot out there. But Pat Mahomes has turned it on. The last 3 games, this looks like vintage Chiefs. Over the last 3 games, they've averaged 32 points per game. And Mahomes, he's averaging 70% completion rate. And it's continuing to get better. Last week against the Lions, which is pretty good defense, 73% completion rate. And now he gets his best receiver back, which is why we called Mahomes a must start. But look, in this matchup, the Raiders, yeah, Rashee Rice, I think he's a must start.
Yeah, I think he's a must start too. And you said, like, let's not look at last year's stats, but that's really all we have, right? Last year and his rookie year, because we don't have any stats this year. But you look at this matchup schematically, the defense here. Raiders, they run the second most cover 3, 44% of the time. If we look at it last year, again, small sample, those 4 games, but against cover 3, he was second in both targets per route run and yards per route run, not on the Chiefs, in the entire NFL. Only Puka Nacua was better than Rashee Rice last year against cover 3. So this is a great schematic matchup. Not to mention, you look at the Raiders corners here, their slot corner, Darnay Holmes, he ranks 83rd out of 108 corners according to Pro Football Focus. And yes, Rashee Rice is their slot guy, right? When he's healthy, that's primarily where he plays. So let's get Rashee Rice in the slot against this slot corner that is not very good against this Raiders secondary. This is going to be a mismatch, right? The Chiefs are going to absolutely dominate the Raiders this week at home. This is a great spot for Rashee Rice to come back. Yeah, I agree. If you have Rashee Rice, he has to be in your lineup this week.
Just when it looked like Courtland Sutton in Denver was becoming a near must-start guy you just set and forget, of course, what happens, and somehow against the worst team in the NFL, pretty sure the Jets have that title, at least right now, under wraps. And yet, despite that, facing that defense, he gave you nothing last week. This was a huge letdown. Again, he had been rolling. I mean, for the season, he's been one of the more dependable receivers overall. He's top 20 in terms of overall yards, air yards. He's getting a huge target share. I mean, it's all in place. Why would he be so bad against a team like the Jets? Well, you know the reasons. If you follow football close enough, you know game script matters, right? They really didn't have to pass the ball all that much. They didn't really need to do much of anything to beat the Jets. They just need to keep their defense on the field, right? Hey, but besides that, Sutton can be frustrating because he's kind of a boom-bust elite receiver, if that makes sense. He's got out of the 6 games they played this year, 4 times he's had at least 5 catches and 18-plus fantasy points, right? Big games. And he's got 2 games with exactly 1 catch. And I probably don't need to spell it out, but those are huge duds. He gave you nothing in fantasy. So what do we expect this week? We expect a huge game, despite the Giants coming off a win themselves. This is actually a better spot for him than it was against the Jets.
Yeah, this feels like an absolute bounce back spot for Courtland Sutton at home against a Giants team that is probably going to come in overconfident this week, right? A lot of young players on this team, they're like, yeah, we got this. They probably don't have it this week. But even if that's not enough, and obviously that's not enough, again, look at the way the defense matches up here. Giants play the second most man and the third most cover one. These are shells that Courtland Sutton just absolutely dominates. This year, he leads the team in targets per out run versus these shells, and he's second in yards per out run, only behind Marvin Mims. But go back to last year, he was ninth among all wide receivers in yards per out run against these shells. And when you look at the Giants, again, like against wide receivers, they're really bad against outside wide receivers like Courtland Sutton. They are allowing the ninth most fantasy points to outside wide receivers. Look, A.J. Brown did not have a big game against his defense like we expected. It was okay. Devonta Smith should have had a huge catch, and those are both outside wide receivers. I'm not worried about that with Courtland Sutton, because when this guy's had opportunities this year, he's had big games. He's got an opportunity this week. I think he's having a big game.
All right, time for another bounce back. For the first time this season, we saw a pretty bad game statistically from Quinshon Judkins in Cleveland. This is the first time that he was under 4 yards per carry, but, I mean, maybe more alarmingly, if you are alarmed here, which, you know, we know fantasy players, they are, right? You got Judkins, you're panicked now. He started to lose some of the snap share. He had been dominating the snaps, but all of a sudden, Jerome Ford, remember him, the same number of snaps as Judkins, and Dylan Sampson even got 15 snaps. So what's the deal now? Are they going to start to go back to some sort of a committee here? Is Judkins going to lose work because he hasn't been as efficient the last couple of games? The answer is clearly no. Look, it just so happened that they were losing not just all game long, but they were losing early, got down a couple scores. This is why they threw the ball a staggering 52 times, right? 52 times despite Dylan Gabriel being the quarterback. That probably wasn't the best plan, but it's what they did. Clearly didn't work. But when you're in passing situations, yeah, Judkins isn't going to be on the field as much. They got Ford out there to try to catch passes, to pass protect. Same thing with Sampson, not to run the ball. Not only is that probably an aberration, but on the other hand here, I don't expect that they're going to be down early against the Dolphins, and even so, it might not matter with how bad this defense is against the run.
Yeah, I don't even know where to start here. Let's just say the Dolphins, they allow the third highest yards per carry, the highest explosive run rate of any defense, the most yards after contact per attempt. But again, kind of like what I talked about with Saquon Barkley, not only is this a great matchup just on paper, but the way Judkins is used and his strengths match up perfectly with the Dolphins' weaknesses. So you look at it on the season right now, 56% of Judkins' rush attempts are man gap rush attempts. On those attempts, he's averaging a very strong 5 yards per carry. Let's look at the Miami Dolphins. Against man gap runs this year, they were allowing the third highest yards per carry and a 54% success rate. The Browns are just going to be able to run the ball with Quinshon Judkins as much as they want. Also, look at this tweet by Ryan Heath, saying the Dolphins have now allowed over 100 yards from scrimmage to a running back in each of their last 5 games. And we're talking about running backs like Kimani Vidal, Rico Dowdle, okay, Breece Hall, James Cook, and even Ramondre Stevenson got 100 scrimmage yards against this defense. Yeah, if Judkins doesn't go off this week, it's going to be an absolute shock.
Now you may be noticing a trend. Some of these good players who are coming off of down weeks, they're due to bounce back. It happens all the time, right? And in this case, Rome Odunze, after the bye, you might be panicked, because you're like, okay, what happened with Luther Burden all of a sudden seeing as many targets? That's right. It wasn't just Rome and everybody else. It was pretty evenly distributed. Even DJ Moore got in on the action almost as much as these other guys because they spread the ball out. They were trying to run the ball. That's weird. Okay, so is this Bears offense going to be different now? Did they decide there's a different plan of attack? No. Like, come on. This game was this game. We can't take away more from this one game just because it happened to be after the bye than the previous 4. But also, look, that worked against Commanders. It doesn't mean they need to do that against the Saints. But besides that, look, Rome Odunze didn't have a good game, right? Get that. He could have had a good game because he had a touchdown that was called back from some ticky-tack OPI call. I mean, this really should have been a score for him. He would have been fine. It may not have been one of his best games, but are really going to be worried about a player who, before this game, had scored at least 15 PPR points in every game so far. We had Rome Odunze as a must-start at this point because he had been so dominant. So, not worried about him, and definitely not worried about the Saints defense.
No, definitely not worried about the Saints defense. You look at it, they allow the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers, but when you look a little deeper, they're allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers who line up on the outside. Right now, Rome Odunze taking 64% of his snaps on the outside. Let's look at some guys who have torched this defense, some outside wide receivers. Hey, remember Marvin Harrison in week 1 when we thought this was going to be his year? 5 catches, 71 yards, and a touchdown. Remember Jawan Jennings? Yeah, you probably don't remember this, but in week 2 against this defense, 5 catches, 89 yards, and a touchdown. Again, he's their outside wide receiver. Okay, JSN in week 3, he's torched everybody, but still 5 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown. And then what did we see last week when we were all in on Stephon Diggs, a guy who kind of splits, half outside, half in the slot? No, it was outside wide receiver Kayshon Boutte, who had 5 catches, 93 yards, and 2 touchdowns last week. They cannot stop outside wide receivers. Their only good corner is their nickel corner, Alontae Taylor, who Rome Odunze is hardly going to see. Rome Odunze should bounce back big time this week. Again, you have to keep this guy locked in your lineup this week, no matter what.
All right, now's the time where we each pick a player that we are significantly higher on. And you know what? You might think, why would you question it? I guarantee we're going to get questions, even if Mike Evans is 100% fully clear to go before Sunday. Some people will be like, do I start him? I think the answer is a resounding yes.
Yeah, and of course this comes down to Mike Evans playing. Look, remember, they play Monday, so you're probably not going to know till later in the week, but all signs sound like he's going to play. Obviously, if he doesn't play, then, oh well, scratch this. But I'm going to assume he's playing, and if he plays, you got to start him. I mean, let's start with the obvious here. He's pretty much all they've got, right? Meka Egbuka, we know he's out. Chris Godwin, we know he's out. Look at it last year from week 12 on when Chris Godwin was out and Mike Evans was healthy. He led all wide receivers in yards, was 7th in receptions, tied for 6th in touchdowns, was 9th in targets, and had the 6th highest air yard share. And remember, he was playing with Jalen McMillan, who was having a nice end of the season last year. Look, all due respect to the Johnsons, Tez and Cameron there, but I don't think they're playing as well as Jalen McMillan was playing last year. But the matchup this week is too good to sit him. They are playing a Lions team that plays the 5th most man and cover 1. About 60% of the time they're in these shells. If you look at it just this year before he got hurt, he was leading the team in targets per route run against these shells, and he was 2nd in yards per route run. But let's go to last year when we have a much larger sample size. He had the 7th highest yards per route run versus these shells among all wide receivers and the 13th highest targets per route run. Not only that, the Lions are allowing the 11th most points to fantasy wide receivers, but again, when you dig in a little deeper and you look at it, they're allowing the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers who line up on the outside. Let's look at some notable outside wide receivers who have torched this defense. Rome Odunze, 7 catches, 128 yards, 2 touchdowns back in week 2. How about everybody's favorite stud wide receiver, Rashad Bateman, 5 catches, 63 yards, and a touchdown in week 3. Jamar Chase, 6 catches, 110 yards, and 2 touchdowns. But remember, he did that with Jake Browning. And then last week, Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy combined for 6 catches, 65 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Look, with Baker baking right now, as long as Evans is healthy, he's all they got. He should absolutely destroy this defense.
Well, speaking of all they got, Jalen Waddle is the passing game in Miami. He's been so solid. Again, you might question, why would we worry about Jalen Waddle? Well, there's a lot of reasons to worry about the Dolphins these days. And I like to think that people focus on the numbers and the stats, but it's not true. People look at the narrative, they believe what they hear, and all we're hearing about is Tua throwing his teammates under the bus and the coach under the bus, and the Dolphins are a dumpster fire, and all that's pretty much true. And now they get to face the Browns, which we know is a really tough defense, but I want to remind you of a couple things. First of all, even bad teams can have good players for fantasy. They won't have nearly as many, but they'll still have some. And right now, Jalen Waddle and Devon Achane are both really good. I mean, Achane is still a must start. Look, Waddle isn't quite there, but he's still a very strong option. And I think this week, he still is an excellent option despite facing Cleveland. Look, this game doesn't have to be a super high scoring game or a shootout, because whatever happens through the air is Jalen Waddle, a little bit of Darren Waller, and that's it, right? So Cleveland is the best run defense in the NFL, like the best. They're not the best pass defense in the NFL too, right? Otherwise, they'd be shutting down every single team that they played. They're a good, but not great pass defense. In fact, they need some help, which is why they actually pulled a mid-season trade. Remember, they swapped corners, Greg Newsome, to try to get Tyson Campbell from the Jags. And that's because their corners have not been great. Look, I know there's been some discussion about the PFF grades and all that. Okay, they're not the end-all be-all, but they're also not completely worthless, right? The truth lies somewhere in between. So all three of the primary corners for Cleveland this year have a grade of 60 or below, right? None of these guys are above average. This is why they traded to get help, and this is why they're susceptible to outside receivers going off against them. And lately, we've seen guys like DK Metcalf, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown all have big games, 19 or more fantasy points. And of course, Jalen Waddle is the number one receiver there. He's the only receiver even worth targeting. That's why since Tyreek Hill's injury the last 2 weeks, Jalen Waddle is among the league leaders in targets. He's got 17 targets just the past 2 games. He's got a target share of 24.8%, which would rank among the best if that was extrapolated to the whole season so far. He's got an air yard share of 51.8%. That's the 4th highest. He can have a huge game even against Cleveland, and if they're shutting down the run, that just means even better numbers for Waddle. Those are some of the players you just got to start this week. They're in such a good position to smash. Hopefully they help you win in week 7. And if you want to know about every player that might be on your roster, we probably have discussed them in these videos in this playlist.